We do not blame the lawlessness of an individual on a whole community.
We could go one way or the other, and we're going to go the wrong way if we keep taking in garbage into our country. Ilhan Omar is garbage.
At 6:03 a.m. near the University of Minnesota, the neighborhood looked calm. Just another early morning with students starting their day. Nobody knew that quiet was seconds away from cracking open. That peaceful silence broke when heavy federal engines rolled in from different directions, moving slow and controlled like they were closing in on something serious. This wasn't random, and it definitely wasn't a routine patrol. Within minutes, agents pushed into a nearby apartment complex, and what they found first shifted everything. Inside units sitting uncomfortably close to student housing, investigators uncovered packaged heroin and fentanyl arranged with purpose. Cash stacked tight and firearms stored like someone expected to need them at any moment. That discovery didn't just raise eyebrows. It exposed a whole hidden operation sitting right behind regular campus life. This wasn't some small neighborhood bust gone too far. This was a calculated federal infiltration designed to drag an established system into the open. The way the substances were packed, the money stored, and the weapons positioned made one thing clear. A network was operating here, not a casual street hustle. As agents widened the search, the stakes changed fast. What started as a local enforcement action shifted into something touching national security concerns, showing just how close organized networks had moved to everyday American life. That realization carried its own weight. Follow military power, because this first move was only the start of something much larger. Inside the apartment building, the contrast felt unreal. Hallways sat still, doors closed, overhead lights buzzing the same dull glow they did every morning. Outside, the parking lot looked calm and routine, engines starting one by one as residents headed to work, unaware of the storm unfolding right next to them. Nothing about that quiet morning hinted that a full federal operation was already tightening around the building. The setup started slow, with no rushed movements, no loud signals, just a quiet shift as teams slipped into position from different angles. Stairwells were sealed off, exterior exits were locked down, and before anyone inside even knew something was happening, the perimeter was already closed tight. Vehicles were parked with careful placement, blocking escape routes without drawing attention from anyone passing by. Agents moved through the complex floor by floor, steady and deliberate, controlling each hallway before stepping deeper inside. This wasn't some chaotic raid meant to create a scene. It was a calculated operation made to eliminate any uncertainty from the moment it began. When entry started, it happened fast. Doors opened under legal authority, rooms were cleared one after another, and the people inside were separated and secured without any kind of struggle. No drawn-out shouting, no frantic confusion, just short commands and smooth movements that showed this was practiced work, not improvisation. Within minutes, the entire space was under federal control, and the search phase kicked in. The very first finds shifted the energy instantly. Inside a bedroom closet, investigators uncovered narcotics pressed and colored to look like real prescription pills, packed neatly into labeled containers and stacked like they were ready for distribution. In a nearby storage area, they found bulk powder bagged and separated, clearly staged for the next step in the operation rather than personal use. Nothing about the setup looked rushed or sloppy. Everything was stored like inventory. Then came the cash. Bundles were discovered in multiple rooms, tucked behind furniture, inside everyday household items, never kept in one single spot. It was spread out strategically to lower the risk if anything ever went wrong. The setup inside that apartment didn't look random. It showed a pattern that came from experience, not panic. The way everything was arranged made it clear whoever ran this place understood how law enforcement works and wasn't scared of pressure. As agents pushed deeper, a stack of false identifications surfaced, each with different names and different faces. It pointed to someone moving carefully, changing identities, and keeping layers of distance between themselves and their operation. Firearms turned up soon after, secured but close at hand, positioned like tools meant for control and protection rather than something kept for show. Nothing felt tossed or forgotten. Every object looked like it had a specific job, reinforcing the idea that this apartment was just one stop in a wider network. As investigators photographed and logged the evidence, their attention narrowed toward one person. Intelligence gathered earlier lined up with what they were seeing on site, connecting everything to a central figure named Ahmed Hassan Noor. Once his name surfaced, the tone of the mission changed instantly. It was no longer just a search of property. It became a focused investigation centered around a single individual, which raised the priority of the case in real time. Then background checks revealed something unexpected, a distant family tie to Ilhan Omar. That detail shifted the entire direction of the operation. What had started as a controlled narcotics search now carried political weight, drawing attention far beyond the walls of the building. Investigators understood right away that what they found here wouldn't be judged only by criminal standards. It would now be viewed through a national lens shaped by public awareness and institutional responsibility. From there, the case stepped out of routine territory. Digital devices, surveillance notes, and online activity were flagged for deeper analysis, signaling that social media conversations and public reaction were about to collide with the investigation. What happened inside that apartment didn't just expose substances or weapons. It exposed proximity to influence, and that changed everything. This was the moment the story opened up, a point where narcotics trafficking, political connection, and online amplification crossed paths inside one operation, guaranteeing the fallout would stretch far beyond the morning's arrests. Outcomes never stay boxed in, and this was the moment everything broke open. Narcotics, political proximity, and online exposure collided at the same time, pushing the case far beyond anything investigators expected to contain. From here on, the real question wasn't about what had already been seized. It was about what the deeper investigation would uncover, the parts that had been running quietly long before the first door was opened. The early raids only revealed the surface layer of something that had been unfolding for nearly 11 months. Federal teams had already drawn the outline of a network that didn't move loudly or violently. It blended into daily life, kept a low profile, and relied on repeated routines instead of risky actions. That patience shaped every step of the operation. Surveillance came first, not the dramatic kind where cars speed through streets. This was slow, steady, and focused on patterns. Investigators monitored vehicles arriving at the same hours, short visits that looked coordinated, not random. Apartments that seemed ordinary on the outside started showing habits that didn't match regular living. Quick exchanges, limited access, movements that stopped and started with precision. The goal wasn't to jump on the first chance to make an arrest. It was to study behavior over time, to watch how people acted when they thought no one was paying attention. After that foundation was built, controlled buys were introduced. Small, careful transactions meant to confirm what surveillance hinted at without tipping off the network. These buys weren't designed to stack big charges immediately. They were spaced apart, quiet steps meant to verify supply chains and reliability inside the operation. Each one added another piece to the puzzle, strengthening the view that this wasn't a basic street crew hustling on demand. It was a structured system following internal direction. Financial tracking filled in the gaps. Analysts followed deposits that looked harmless on their own but noticeable when placed in a timeline. Money slid into accounts, moved out quickly, reappeared somewhere else, divided into amounts small enough to dodge automated banking alerts. Cash withdrawals matched known substance movements, linking the financial flow directly to the physical distribution. Then a larger picture appeared. The money didn't stay in one city. It traveled outward, crossing state lines, and even leaving the country in small fragments. Each transfer looked harmless alone, but when investigators combined them, the true scope emerged. Distribution routes stretched across several states, connecting urban areas that didn't seem related at all on the surface. Beneath that surface, though, they were tied together by logistics, timing, and payment streams that ran with quiet precision. Safe locations operated more like temporary drop points than permanent hubs, letting inventory shift before any real pressure could build. The strength of the network came from how spread out it was, not how large any one spot looked. That spread made it harder to disrupt because taking down a single location didn't slow the overall system. It just rerouted. At this point, the investigation changed shape. It stopped being about one suspect or one specific offense. The data showed a level of coordination that didn't come from one person chasing profit. The roles were structured, tasks stayed consistent, and backup plans were baked into the daily routine. The real challenge wasn't an individual. It was a system that replaced people the same way a machine swaps parts, and it kept running no matter who got removed. That understanding created the first major shift. What started as a focused case with tight objectives expanded into a full federal campaign. Agencies lined up resources, timelines were rebuilt, and the mission shifted away from prosecution alone. The goal wasn't just to prove guilt, it was to break the system's ability to function, not just closing cases, but collapsing the structure the network depended on. This was where enforcement turned into strategy. And the weight of that shift stretched beyond the investigation itself. A network capable of moving narcotics and money across state lines and international borders wasn't just a threat to public health or local safety. Its reach into everyday neighborhoods, campuses, and financial pathways placed it closer to regular American life than anyone realized. Leaving it alone would mean accepting that organized systems could operate quietly inside communities without drawing the slightest attention. By the time federal teams received authorization for coordinated action, most of the groundwork was already locked in. Months of surveillance, tracking, and analysis had built a full map of how everything connected and where the pressure points were. What came next wasn't a dramatic leap, just for show. It was a calculated move based on understanding how the pieces fit together and where disruption would hit hardest. This became the moment the story crossed a line that couldn't be reversed. Investigators had only scratched the surface, but the structure underneath was finally starting to show. Stay with military power. And at just after 7 a.m., the operation shifted from preparation into execution. The timing was intentional. Morning routines were in motion, traffic was steady, and people were settled into predictable patterns. That meant the targets were most likely in place across the city and beyond. Multiple teams received the same green light within seconds, and what followed wasn't a chase or a dramatic standoff. It was a synchronized hit meant to cut off the network's ability to react before anyone understood what was happening. The first stop was the apartment complex already shaken by earlier actions. But this time, the goal wasn't to uncover more evidence. It was to shut the place down completely. Teams moved with direct assignments, securing anyone still inside, locking down storage spots, and making sure nothing could be moved, wiped, or hidden. Rooms were cleared at the same time. Evidence was logged step by step, and every exit was locked in without causing disruption. Within minutes, the building was no longer usable as part of the operation. Its role in the network ended the moment those doors closed. A second team moved on to a warehouse several miles away. From the outside, it blended into its surroundings, looking just like any ordinary industrial space among dozens of others serving basic businesses. But once investigators stepped inside, the real purpose was clear. They went past the front offices and into secured work areas where equipment for substance processing was arranged neatly, not in hiding. Everything was set up for efficiency. Mixing tools, packaging supplies, and measuring devices were staged for constant use, pointing toward production, not storage. Deeper into the warehouse, agents uncovered handwritten notes and printed sheets that laid out distribution routes stretching far beyond state borders. City names repeated across multiple pages, forming a quiet map of movement across the country. These weren't guesses or brainstorming. The notes listed quantities, timing, and handoff points with a level of precision that only comes from regular execution. This warehouse wasn't a final stop. It was a junction feeding multiple markets while staying unnoticed in plain sight. While those sites were being secured, a third team moved toward a residential home tucked in a quiet suburban area. The environment couldn't have been more different from the earlier locations. Trimmed lawns, empty driveways, and peaceful sidewalks made the place look like any typical neighborhood. Nothing from the outside hinted that this property played a role in a regional operation. Even though the suburban property looked harmless, it carried a critical role in keeping the entire operation alive. Inside, investigators found a setup focused not on narcotics, but on money. The person running that space handled the financial flow, and the system they built showed serious calculation. Records revealed repeated small deposits, timed carefully to avoid attention and spread across different accounts to stay under the radar. Transfers moved outward in stages, passing through middle points before disappearing across international lines. Devices used to track balances, timing, and routing were kept close, a sign of constant monitoring rather than casual involvement. This wasn't someone doing errands or acting as a side helper. This spot functioned as a control center for the network's financial lifeline, connecting all three sites into one coordinated system. Across every location, the defining quality was precision. No dramatic confrontations, no drawn-out back and forth, no show of force beyond what was required to keep the environment controlled. Each team stepped in knowing exactly what they had to secure, completed the task, and moved on. By striking multiple sections of the network at once, investigators removed any chance for the system to react. No early alerts traveled through the chain. No assets were moved in time. The entire structure had to absorb the impact without preparation. The scale of what happened became clear as updates from each team came together. Evidence was collected, suspects were held, and every operational space was shut down from within. In one morning, the network's ability to move product, manage money, and coordinate distribution was cut apart. This wasn't a symbolic show of force. It was a direct shutdown built through timing, planning, and coordination instead of spectacle. What made this phase decisive wasn't the list of items recovered. It was the operations that were prevented from continuing. Supply lines were broken. Communication routes were exposed and disrupted. Financial channels were uncovered and frozen. The morning demonstrated how federal coordination can compress months of investigative groundwork into moments that carry permanent consequences. By acting everywhere at the same time, agencies ensured no single site could make up for the loss of another. Once final clearances were called and teams started withdrawing, the outcome was already set. The campaign met its immediate objectives without drawing more attention than the situation demanded. The network was never pushed into the open. It was surrounded, studied, and taken apart right where it operated. This was the payoff from the investigation's first breakpoint. A system that once moved quietly across state lines and international borders was dragged into the light and stripped of the parts that kept it running. But even as the locations went silent, investigators didn't consider the job finished. What mattered now wasn't the buildings or the equipment. It was the data, the digital trails, and the long line of consequences that would unfold after the coordinated actions ended. The scenes left behind felt almost unreal. Hallways that had seen controlled, steady movement just hours earlier now stood empty. Doors sealed, lights buzzing softly like nothing unusual had taken place. Outside, suspects were walked to vehicles one at a time, hands secured, heads lowered, moving without resistance. Evidence was boxed, labeled, and loaded with methodical care. Every item was treated not as a victory piece, but as part of a far bigger structure investigators were trying to understand. The intensity of the morning had faded, leaving behind a stillness heavy with unanswered questions. That silence marked the shift into a new phase. The visible action was finished, but everyone involved understood that the raids were only the outer shell. The real work began once the doors closed and the evidence reached the analysts. Buildings were no longer the center of focus. The investigation moved into rooms lined with screens, wires, and long tables stacked with seized devices. Laptops were powered on. Isolated phones were placed into controlled systems. Handwritten ledgers were opened under bright lamps. Each object carried fragments of a story, incomplete on its own, but revealing when pieced together. Analysts and cyber specialists worked in rotating shifts, pulling data, recovering erased files, and mapping connections that someone had gone out of their way to hide. The pace was steady but relentless, driven by the understanding that whoever saw the full picture first held the advantage. At the beginning, the information felt scattered. Contacts with no context, transaction logs that ended too cleanly, notes that named places but didn't explain why they mattered. But slowly the fragments began aligning. Patterns formed in the background movements. Timelines that seemed unrelated began syncing. Actions that looked random started fitting into predictable rhythms. As analysts continued pulling the threads together, it became clear that the structure investigators thought they had dismantled still had deeper layers waiting to be uncovered. Messages started lining up with the movements investigators had tracked for months. Timelines from surveillance matched financial entries, and the rhythms seen in earlier distribution points began clicking into place. Locations that once looked unrelated started clustering together, forming corridors that linked cities, accounts, and specific players into one connected structure. This became the moment when the true scale could no longer be ignored. What first looked like a loose mix of individuals revealed itself as an organized network, fully capable of shifting roles and routes whenever pressure increased. Its strength didn't come from secrecy alone. It came from design. By spreading out its risks across different locations and responsibilities, the operation limited exposure and delayed anyone noticing what it was actually doing. But that same spread out design created its own weakness. Once investigators linked enough data points, the entire system appeared in full view. The coordinated campaign hit that weakness directly. By taking out key points at the same time, investigators forced the network into a position where recovery needed coordination it no longer had. Production, distribution, and finance had been separated on paper, but in reality they relied on constant alignment. The raids shattered that alignment, and the data confirmed the damage. Without those links, the network couldn't rebuild by simply plugging in new people. The architecture itself had been broken. As analysts pulled the findings together, the focus shifted again. Attention turned inward, toward understanding how such a system managed to operate so close to everyday life for so long. The investigation was no longer just about criminal responsibility. It stretched into questions about oversight, enforcement gaps, and the places where trust had been given instead of checked. That realization became the second major turning point. The mission was no longer about dismantling an outside threat alone. It became about examining the spaces that allowed that threat to settle in and function without interruption. By the end of this phase, the outline of a broader reckoning was clear. The evidence didn't just reveal how the network operated. It exposed exactly where accountability had faded and where serious corrective steps could no longer be avoided. The quiet room stacked with data revealed more than any single raid ever could. They set the stage for a process that would reach far past arrests and into a deeper institutional response. The real consequences of the operation didn't show themselves during the morning strikes. They surfaced afterward, in the slower days when the noise faded and the facts settled into public view. What had been removed wasn't just a system of narcotics and hidden money. It was a layer of assumed safety many people believed they had. That realization spread quietly, carrying more weight than any headline or single arrest. What became impossible to ignore was that the threat hadn't come from outside the community. It didn't arrive with force or sudden disruption. It grew inside familiar spaces, tucked near schools, ordinary apartments, and routines that people thought protected them by default. The danger wasn't defined solely by criminal intent. It was shaped by access, proximity, and the ability to move in plain sight without raising suspicion. That understanding shifted how the case was viewed across affected neighborhoods. Reactions followed a steady pattern. First came shock, a pause that felt heavy as residents tried to process what had been operating so close. Conversations broke off. People hesitated to speak. Questions hung in the air with no immediate answers. Then came silence. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that settles after trust has been cracked. Neighbors spoke less, watched more, and reevaluated what they believed about the systems built to protect them. Confidence didn't disappear overnight. It thinned slowly, fading at the edges. Images from the aftermath captured that shift in ways statements never could. A resident standing outside a taped-off building, arms folded, staring at sealed doors that once seemed unremarkable. A parent guiding a child past police lights without explaining what happened, unsure how to shape the truth. A flag hanging still on a porch, no longer read as comfort, but as a reminder that responsibility had been ignored somewhere along the line. These moments carried a sense of loss that didn't come from violence, but from misplaced faith. People weren't grieving what happened. They were grieving what they assumed could never happen so close to them. Government response arrived with a noticeably controlled tone. There were no loud declarations, no attempt to brand the operation as a celebration or an achievement. Officials spoke carefully, acknowledging the seriousness of what had been exposed and the duty to handle it thoroughly. Their statements focused on oversight, internal review, and correction, rather than pointing blame or searching for praise. The message was steady without needing volume. Systems had failed. Those failures would have to be examined, understood, and repaired. Accountability was no longer optional, it was expected. Steps were laid out to rebuild order and restore accountability. Internal reviews were launched, oversight tools strengthened, and monitoring procedures tightened. The focus wasn't on punishment alone. It was on repairing trust, because once trust breaks, it cannot be demanded back. It has to be earned slowly through transparency and consistent action. The response made it clear that this situation reached far beyond a single investigation. It required structural attention, not symbolic moves. As the public narrative leveled out, the nature of the threat became clearer. This wasn't just about narcotics passing through a city. It was a form of infiltration that fed on assumptions. It was betrayal that hid behind familiarity. It was a quiet kind of institutional decay that built up slowly when vigilance faded. Combined, these factors created a danger far more complex than simple street activity because it grew through invisibility and closeness to everyday life. The end of this phase came without celebration. No feeling of closure, just a steady acknowledgement that what had been uncovered demanded reflection before anyone could talk about resolution. The work ahead wouldn't be defined by raids, seizures, or headlines. It would show itself in reforms, oversight, and accountability that developed over time. The reckoning was subdued, weighty, and still unfinished. It set up the final question that rose naturally from everything uncovered. What happens when a system begins to fail from the inside, not through dramatic collapse, but through quiet neglect that lets harmful structures take hold? That question now reaches far beyond one operation, far beyond a single neighborhood, and far beyond the boundaries of one city. This wasn't just about one group or one network. It reflected a broader truth about modern institutions. Vulnerabilities don't introduce themselves. They don't arrive with warnings. They take root where attention slips, where systems become comfortable, and where complexity grows faster than oversight. Across the country, similar conditions exist in places that look stable on the surface. And when those blind spots widen, the consequences can move quietly until they are impossible to ignore. What happened here served as a reminder that strength doesn't only come from enforcement. It comes from constant awareness of how easily trust can erode when no one is watching closely enough. Criminal networks adjust fast, switching methods, shifting locations, and swapping identities to stay a step ahead of pressure. Systems built to counter those networks have to operate differently. They must be able to respond, but they also need the ability to monitor themselves, to recognize weak spots before someone else takes advantage of them. The lesson here isn't that failure always comes. It's that resilience only exists when there is steady effort and real correction behind it. This moment asks for more than quiet observation from the public. It calls for awareness, patience, and real support for the agencies working to protect both safety and institutional integrity. Their work isn't always dramatic, but it is the foundation that keeps trust from slipping. Accountability doesn't return through one major operation. It returns through long-term transparency and consistent vigilance. People rarely see the work that shields communities before threats turn into full crises. But that work is happening every day, and it deserves attention, not only when something breaks, but while it is being held together. Support the federal team standing that line with steady discipline. And if you want to stay informed on how these operations shape national security in ways most people never notice, make sure to drop a comment, like the video, subscribe, share it with someone who needs to understand this story, and I'll see you on the next one.